Hi, welcome to Qigong Project. I'm Robert Koons, and today we're going to talk about Buddhist Qigong. What is Buddhist Qigong? How many varieties are there? What's the difference between Buddhist Qigong, contemporary Qigong, and Daoist Qigong? We are going to try to answer all of those questions today. I have a lazy eye. That's why I wear the glasses, by the way. Okay, so anyway, to be serious here, Buddhist Qigong is a way of classifying Qigong practices. In the last video about Daoist Qigong, you'll remember that I mentioned that really before the 1950s, there was no conception of anything called Daoist Qigong or Buddhist Qigong. Actually, before that, the term Qigong really wasn't used. Right? The term was used occasionally as an adjective or as a verb, but very rarely as a noun in Chinese energetic practices. And before then, Chinese energetic practices tended to go by different names, like Xiu Dao, these kind of things, right? Shaolin, these kind of things. Cultivating the Dao, self-refinement, etc., right? Usually they wouldn't call them Qigong or something like that. But since the 1950s, people began to use this term Qigong, and it became accepted as the meaning of a certain type of healthy practices which emphasize the cultivation of qi in the human body. And those things can include things like stillness practices that cultivate qi, so Jingong, various types of sort of internal meditative practices, breath work, and movement practices, Donggong, right? Daoyin, stretching, these kind of things, right? So all of these things can fall into the category of Qigong. So if we look at Qigong as defined through that metric, then it's hard to say really that there's a Buddhist Qigong, so to speak. What I mean by that is that unlike Taoism, in which certain schools of Taoism, like the Wudang school, wholeheartedly accepted the concept of Qigong and incorporated Qigong into their practices, there's really not such a thing in Chinese Buddhism, as far as I know. There's not any, Buddhist temple Qigong, so to speak, right? Maybe with the exception of the Shaolin temple. So that might be worth considering as a source of Buddhist temple Qigong. But it's not as prevalent as with Taoism. And there may be a couple of reasons for that, but we can get to those a little bit later. I think that the important thing here, though, is to understand why people refer to things like Buddhist Qigong and Daoist Qigong, right? Why is it that we have these words which don't really accurately describe the traditional practices of Buddhism or Taoism, which predate Qigong, right? Like Tuna, Daoyin, etc., right? And so in this sense, we need to try to understand what people mean when they say Buddhist Qigong. And in my opinion, the term is actually anachronistic, or at least retroactive, application of the concept of Qigong to describe certain types of Buddhist practices that deal with qi. So if we view it through that lens, what we're actually doing as modern Qigong practitioners when we say we practice Buddhist Qigong or Daoist Qigong or Confucian Qigong or Chinese medicine Qigong is actually looking at a very specific subset of practices within those schools that deal with qi specifically, that are specifically designed for the purposes of cultivating qi. Ergo, we call those things Qigong as Qigong practitioners. So what that means is, as a practitioner of Daoist Qigong or Buddhist Qigong, I don't have to be a Taoist, so to speak, or a Buddhist, so to speak, to be able to practice those things that those schools incorporated at various times in their history, including the present day. Whereas if I were a Taoist or if I were a Buddhist, I might prefer not to use the word Qigong to describe similar practices, even though on paper they can be pretty similar sometimes. So what I mean specifically by that is that if you take a practice like chanting, for instance, chanting can have positive benefits for the human body, whether you're chanting and using it in order to cure your own ailments or to treat your own ailments or improve the condition of your body, or whether you're chanting in order to have an effect on other people, right? Chanting can have a positive effect on the human body, regardless of whether you do it from a religious perspective or a secular perspective. So many of these things, like sounding Qigongs, right, like the 6 healing sounds, let's say ostensibly come from Taoism or Buddhism, but ultimately they're applied in modern Qigong as a health practice only, rather than having those religious accoutrements that Taoism and Buddhism have. So rather than something which is perhaps geared toward devotional practice or the use of deities in the body or something like that, instead people practice for specific health purposes. Now, if you go far back enough in the Chinese literature, you'll find, in fact, that that was the original way those practices were done anyway, like the 6 healing sounds, for instance, not necessarily temple chanting, because those are slightly different things. But there's always been this precedent for that. And these things that we call Buddhist and Daoist Qigong are roughly, let's say, influenced by multiple streams of different types of self-cultivation in China, whether they're, relatively more Taoist or Buddhist or secular, et cetera, et cetera. So now that we have that out of the way, we have a sort of working definition of Qigong as this energetic practice that came about after the 1950s, that's based on older practices, but doesn't necessarily require us to be part of, affiliated with a temple or some other thing to practice it. Then we can start really talking in earnest about what Buddhist Qigong is. So, one of the major problems with defining Buddhist Qigong and Daoist Qigong, but especially Buddhist Qigong, is that it's not completely clear where the energetic part of the practice ends and the meditative part of the practice begins. And what I mean by that is that we have to decide whether or not we would like seated meditation to be categorized as Qigong. And in my personal opinion, some types of seated meditation are better not to be categorized as Qigong. So what that means relative to Buddhism is that sitting in Chan, right, sitting in dhyana or Chan, or meditative concentration, I don't think really qualifies as Qigong, because the central purpose of the practice is not energetic in nature. It's meant to reveal the original nature of the mind, or the original nature of consciousness. By the way, if you hear some noise in the background, there's some construction going on in my street, but it's been a while since I recorded a video and I didn't want to wait too long. So my apologies if there's some beeping and, trucks driving around. In any event, right, this idea of meditation in order to reveal the original consciousness, I don't think really can be defined as Qigong, because that's not the purpose of Qigong. Qigong is in this case, it really is described by its name. It's meant for healing the body using Qi. So that's one distinction that we have to get out of the way before we can define this thing really well. And this is my own personal opinion, okay? Some people will agree with me, some people will disagree with me. That's the nature of trying to understand these arts and trying to define them. But then at the same time, there are other Buddhist practices which I think are a little bit more in the gray area. And things like visualization, for instance, visualizing different Buddhas and deities, or perhaps visualizing oneself as one of these Buddhas or deities, which maybe come from like Vajrayana practice via Tibet, for example, or via very, very old Chinese documents, which, were part of the early development of Buddhism in China. These kind of things, they certainly do have an effect on the qi of the body. And some people do categorize them as Qigong, right? So there's considered to be an entire school of Buddhist Qigong, which is they call Mizong, or like lost track, or Tibetan Buddhist Qigong approximately. And that approach, again, I think if you were to speak with Buddhists, they might not like that. It doesn't fit that well into sort of their doctrinal view of what they're trying to do with these visualization practices. But many Qigong people hold them to be, approximately consistent with Qigong if you view it through that lens. So then other practices like specific breathing practices and so on perhaps could be called Qigong relative to the way that you want to practice them, right? So if you practice them with healing in mind, and if you incorporate them into sort of a Qigong worldview, which is based around the idea of cultivating healthy Qi, then essentially they qualify as Qigong, at least relative to your own practice. So now that we have that other layer of sort of, let's say, logic implanted into our thinking for the moment, at least as scaffolding, let's move on to the next thing. What do Qigong practitioners in China actually view as being Buddhist Qigong? So let me see, do I have the book handy? So this book is a really useful one. It's called 中医 Qigong 学, Chinese medicine Qigong study. And it is a major Qigong textbook used. It's written by Liu Tianjun, and it is used in Chinese medicine universities in China to teach Qigong. So that book has a number of definitions of Buddhist Qigong, Daoist Qigong, Confucian Qigong, etc., folk Qigong, martial arts Qigong, etc. And it's certainly not my only source, but I thought it was quite useful because it speaks about the particular types of Qigong method that you can find in each school of thought. And it essentially says that Buddhist Qigong is separated into a number of different schools. And I'm going to, now their definition is a little different from my definition, but I'm going to speak to a number of the potential ways that we could categorize the schools of Buddhism as they apply to Qigong practice. So I think that it's useful to understand a little bit about the history of Buddhism in order to be able to understand what they're doing with Qi practice. Buddhism came to China during the Han Dynasty, which, if you look at the dynastic history of China, it's the second major dynasty. So the first dynasty was the Qin Dynasty. It occurred, it was a very short dynasty. I think in the early part of early 200 BC or something like that. It lasted about 20 or 30 years, not a very long time. And it was replaced by the Han, which was around 220 BC and lasted to about 220 AD, or 200 AD, I should say. And Buddhism began to trickle into China during the Han. At that time, the Buddhism that was coming to China was very Indian in flavor. And Chinese monks began to translate Buddhist documents. So during that time, you can consider it as sort of the early stage of Buddhism in China. Then what ultimately happened, and where we derive this idea that there's Buddhist Qigong in China, comes from the idea that many Chinese Buddhists started to have around 400, 500, and 600 AD, where they started to formulate Chinese culturally relevant schools of Buddhism. So, as an example, the Tiantai Buddhist school is a school of Buddhism which is a very distinctly Chinese approach to practicing Buddhism. The Tiantai school was founded by a monk named Zhi Yi, and Zhi Yi wrote a number of texts. One of them is called Xiao Zhi Guan, or the lesser, let's say, Samatha and Vipassana. Another one is called Tongmeng Zhi Guan, so the Tongmeng, Shamatha and Vipassana, and so on. And Zhi's big idea, aside from sort of establishing monastic rules and stuff like that, was that people should practice a type of meditation which alternated between Shamatha and Vipassana. So let's say calm abiding and mindfulness, for lack of a better word. And so those two words that he applied to describe Shamatha and Vipassana were Zhi and Guan. So Zhi means Shamatha. Zhi means to stop. And then Guan means to observe. So Vipassana means to observe. The basic principle of Zhi Guan is that you use an object to stop the mind. So you use, like, let's say, part of the body, like the lower abdomen, like the lower dantian, which they call the udana, right? You use that to stop the mind by focusing on it. And then once the mind is stopped and focused and calm, then afterward you can just observe the empty mind while it rests there. And then going back and forth between this stopping and observing process can help you eventually to realize the innate nature of mind and realize the Buddha mind. So his school of meditation is essentially, based on those two ideas, Shamatha and Vipassana. But then ultimately, Zhi Yi also included a number of energetic methods, which he referred to as medical methods, and they're included in the text Tongmeng Zhi Guan. So these medical methods they're really interesting because they partially borrow from Buddhist ideas about medicine, which come from like Tibet and Nepal, right? And so those ideas are using the four elements, right? So fire, wind, water, and earth in order to explain the problems that people's bodies experience. And then he also uses ideas from Chinese medicine using the 5 elements to describe illness. And so he says there's many, many different ways to treat illness, but one way we can do it is by using meditative methods that use the breath or that use the mind in various different ways. So Zhi, his school of quote-unquote Buddhist Qigong, really is focused on the idea of using breathing practices such as the 6 healing sounds, which are directly borrowed from Taoism, by the way. Well, we can say Taoism. I don't know. They're directly borrowed from, this traditional Chinese practice that dates back to the Han Dynasty of the 6 healing sounds, which is commonly associated with Taoism. He uses things like directing the breath to different parts of the body. He uses things like, imagining the area under the feet, and various other things, right? Including stopping the mind in the place where there's an illness and just, staying there in stillness until it begins to feel better. Many, many different methods for focusing the mind in order to make yourself feel better when you're ill. So that's a really good example of an early iteration of what we might call Buddhist Qigong. And indeed, today when people want to appeal to Buddhist Qigong, they will often pull out the Zhi as example of a pioneer in that field. And in fact, many of his practices are still applied by people who, quote unquote, practice Buddhist Qigong. So that's a good example of one way that this idea manifests. But certainly there's more to it than that. So another really good example would be the idea of chanting as a way to develop energetic abilities. And I think one of the fascinating things, if you ever spend time in Chinese temples, is that the chanting practices, that the liturgy and things that are done like that can actually have a very strong energetic effect. And certainly it's not uncommon for the parishioners of a temple and the, let's say the clergy of the temple to be able to develop an energetic relationship together through chanting. And that can assist them in their meditation practice, right? So these kind of things are not uncommon. But how it manifests in Qigong, let's say, is perhaps a Buddhist-influenced approach to Qigong. So in modern Qigong, you can see many, many different practitioners, like Pang Ming is a good example, the founder of Zheneng Qigong, who use sounding practices as a means to focus on specific organs in the body, or as a means to send the feeling of qi to other people, so that when they practice their qigong practice, they get a stronger benefit from their own practice, right? So these would be things that could be considered to be Buddhist-influenced qigong methods or Daoist-influenced qigong methods. But another example, which I think is a very, very clear example and a very good one, is the practice of Yi Jin Jing and Shi Sui Jing. So you probably have heard of Yi Jin Jing, the tendon changing classic, and Shi Sui Jing, the marrow washing classic, right? And so these practices may be Buddhist in character, they may be Taoist in character. There's a whole other video to be made about that. That's a very complex subject with a really nuanced history. If you want to read a good book about it, I would suggest Mayor Shahar's book, the Shaolin Monastery. Absolutely fantastic. That will definitely help you improve your way of thinking about Buddhist Qigong and martial arts methods from Shaolin. But in any event, right, these practices were probably created by a person named Zining Daoren. Let's say the person of the Tao of purple coagulation, right? That's an approximate, let's say, English translation. But just because he's called Daoren doesn't mean necessarily that he was a Taoist. He could have been a Buddhist. It's not known, actually, whether he was a Taoist or a Buddhist. But what he thought was that in order to cultivate, realization, people should practice physical exercise paired with meditation. And so the Yi Jin Jing, the tendon changing classic, is a set of exercises which is based on Shaolin martial arts concepts in order to stretch out the body approximately. And then his meditation technique, the marrow washing classic, is very similar to Taoist internal alchemy. And so you could say, well, that sounds like martial arts Qigong and Daoist Qigong. Why do you say it's Buddhist Qigong? You have to look at who practices it. So the story is that this is something practiced by the Shaolin temple, right? It's a Buddhist temple that does, otherwise Buddhist practices. The majority of the history of Shaolin wasn't as a famous martial arts temple, it was as a Buddhist temple. They had martial arts because they had to defend themselves during difficult times, right? But mainly it was a Buddhist temple, not a place of martial arts. Really, Shaolin as a martial arts tourism place is a modern phenomenon. And so this kind of practice can be conceptualized as Buddhist Qigong because Buddhists practice it, right? And this is one of the areas where it's really important to make the point that before the modern times, before Chinese people started to create very, very clear distinctions between different types of practices, you can't say that Buddhism has an absolute definite character and Taoism has an absolute definite character that are completely separate from each other. Actually, there's a lot of times when Buddhism and Taoism practice almost identical practices, and yet, because they were practiced by one or the other group, we have a tendency to call their practices Buddhist or Taoist, right? So sometimes the definitions are not that clear. And a lot of, so-called Taoist practices like Jinggang Gong, number one, Golden Vajra Qigong is a Buddhist name. Number two, it's practiced by a lot of Taoists. And then, can we say also it's very, very similar to I Ching Jing. So, it's kind of hard to say what's the absolute separation between these things. And really, actually, if we're very honest, there's not such a clear separation. Sometimes these terminologies like Buddhist and Taoist are just convenient. So, in that sense, right, we can look at like I Ching Jing and Shi Sui Jing as being martial arts, Qigong, maybe Daoist Qigong in some context, Buddhist Qigong in some contexts. And I hope my friend won't mind, but I heard from a knowledgeable friend that actually the Buddhists and the Taoists even, sometimes argue a little bit about who those styles belong to, right? So this is one of those things in Qigong culture where, again, it's not always so clear as we'd like it to be, right? You can't find perfect definitions for these things. So I would say that, again, that's a style that we can very clearly put into Buddhism if we practice a Buddhist tradition, with that style incorporated in it, such as being like, from the Shaolin Temple, for instance. But then at the same time, if you were practicing Taoist practices at Wudang and you happen to learn those styles, well, then I guess they're Taoist, right? So, that's just how it is. Sometimes it's relative to the tradition that you study or that you identify with, or, perhaps that you're even initiated into, right? So that'd be another example. And then another good example would be, again, things like Vajrayana. So many modern Qigong practitioners and many modern Buddhists in China are fascinated by Tibetan Buddhism. And, I think that might have been at one point somewhat of a, risque thing to say in public, but now I think it's pretty well accepted. Tibetan Buddhism has an outsized influence in China, and indeed Tibetan or perhaps Mongolian, let's say practices from that part of Asia have been influential since the Yuan dynasty, so since the time of Genghis Khan. And you can see Tibetan or Mongolian script, even in images in certain Taoist books, like the text Xingming Guizhi. It has a method of practicing the 5 Buddha families, which if you practice, Vajrayana, you'll know about this. Not necessarily from Xingming Guizhi, but you'll know about the 5 Buddha families, right? There's the 5 differently colored Buddhas that represent different aspects of realization. These ideas are incorporated in Taoist texts like Xingming Guizhi all the way back to, like the 1400s or 1500s. And so in this sense, Vajrayana Buddhist practice, which came by way of, what we call West China today, but like, let's say approximately Tibet or, these kind of areas. I don't want to say Nepal because Nepal doesn't qualify as China at this time. Or like Mongolia or whatever, right? They were deeply influential on energetic practices in Taoism and in Chinese Buddhism. And so ultimately, a lot of that stuff has kind of made its way into Qigong culture. and people in the Qigong world like to learn from it. So I'll give you one really good example. A popular 20th century Buddhist thinker who was born in mainland China and eventually moved to Taiwan, whose name was Nanhuai Qin. You might have heard of him. He wrote extensively about the chakra system of the body and tried to relate the chakra system to the dantians and the different energetic orifices used in Daoist internal alchemy. So even in that context, right, you can see that there's this great exchange of ideas going on between Buddhism and between Taoism. And in fact, if you look a few videos ago, I made a video about the relationship between internal alchemy and yoga. And I talked a little bit about the relationship of the chakra system to the energetic system of the Taoist body. There's really is a historical strong relationship between those two things, even though, again, it's a very unclear relationship in some ways. But if you look at the texts, you can find it. So again, we have another example where things like Vajrayana, which, originally wasn't even Chinese, makes it into China via this dissemination of that type of Buddhism over a long period of time and eventually gets incorporated into the Qigong family. It's a real thing. And then there's also some really interesting other examples. Now, again, you'll remember I said I don't think certain types of seated meditation should necessarily be taken as Qigong, but just as an example of one style, which sometimes is considered to be Qigong, like especially in texts like this, for instance, Chinese medicine Qigong study, is internal alchemy. So in internal alchemy, there is actually an entire Buddhist school of internal alchemy. It's called the Wuliu school. It's kind of a Buddhist Taoist school together. And so they talk about cultivating Buddhahood and cultivating immortality. And so the founders of the Wuliu school, Wu Chongshu and Liu Huayang, they were involved in both Buddhism and Taoism. And so if you read Wuliu school internal alchemy documents, they use Buddhist terms to describe Taoist ideas. So again, these borders are never perfectly clear because many Taoist books use Buddhist ideas too. And so it's really hard to make absolute perfect clarity about what belongs to who and so on and so forth. I think it may be better to say, let's say that you practice Buddhism and you've done it for many years, and you follow a Buddhist monk and you learned energetic methods from that monk, and you choose to also practice Qigong, or you identify the methods you learned as Qigong, then what you're practicing is Buddhist Qigong, even if it came originally from Taoism or from some other source. And if you practice with a Taoist, or you're a Taoist initiated person, and you do Qigong, and it's Taoist in nature, then it's Taoist Qigong, right? That's approximately how I think about that. And these ideas have been mutually influential for a long time. So just to jump back to Zhi Yi, who we started with, right? The founder of the Zhiguan school of Buddhist meditation. He uses the concept of Udana, which he talks about as being about 4 fingers width under the navel. But he says the Chinese name for Udana is Dantian. So you see, he takes an Indian idea, Udana, and he applies the concept of Dantian, the elixir field, to explain it, right? So again, if you want to define Buddhist Qigong, you should understand that the thing that defines it is partially the fact that it's associated with Buddhism, but also, more importantly, the fact that it exists within the broader tapestry of the Chinese conception of the energetic body. And that energetic body began to be discovered before Buddhism and Taoism were discrete religious traditions, and it's continued to develop into modern times during the secular era. And so probably ultimately Buddhist Qigong, Daoist Qigong, martial arts Qigong, Chinese medicine Qigong, and Confucian Qigong, which are the major schools of Qigong, broadly speaking, can just be defined as different flavors of Chinese Qigong. They're all basically influenced by approximately the same ideas. So I hope that wasn't too much of a letdown for you, and we didn't get to, unfortunately, fly away on a cloud to Shambhala or do anything cool like that. But what I do want to say is that when you look at these categories of Qigong, in the past, we've had some very, very good literature in English. Yang Jingming's The Root of Chinese Qigong is a wonderful example of early English language Qigong literature that explains a lot, but especially about the different categories of Qigong. But it's also useful to take even deeper look into those categories and understand that actually they all originate from the same source, which is this very ancient Chinese view of the human body as having the ability to generate and direct energy for the purposes of healing. And so whether we're talking about any of the schools, Buddhist, Daoist, Confucian, Chinese medicine, martial arts, folk Qigong, whatever, it's all approximately influenced by the same set of views. And that's all I got to say about that. Thank you very, very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Hey, check out my courses, which are, how do I get my finger on screen? There we go. Check out my courses, which are in the comments. They're pretty cool. I really appreciate that you watched the entire video. Thanks again, and see you in the next one. By the way, if you want to know about something specific about Qigong, let me know in the comments and I will do my best to make a video about it. I've heard a couple of your requests, and I do have plans to make ones about breathing very soon. So thank you for the request, and I'll get on it as soon as possible. See you next time.